The camera fades in on a quiet study. The mentor's voice is calm, deliberate. He thought it was a joke, a throwaway challenge meant to humiliate. Win this and I'll give you $100 million, the billionaire said, smirking. She was the maid's daughter, invisible in the glittering chaos of his world. But when she walked away from that room, he had no idea he had just handed her the blueprint to destroy his arrogance and win. The scene is opulent, chandeliers catching the light, champagne glasses chiming in the background. The billionaire, Leonard Graves, is in his element surrounded by CEOs, senators, and foreign dignitaries. In his mind, this is his kingdom, and everyone here is a pawn. Except one person doesn't fit the picture. Elena Daniels, 21 years old, wearing a borrowed dress that still has the dry cleaner's tag tucked inside the seam. She isn't here for the party. She's here because her mother, the head maid, had been ordered to work an extra shift that night. While delivering champagne, Elena overheard Leonard boasting about a mental game he had invented, something so complex he claimed, that only a genius who's half insane could solve it. He said it like it was gospel, daring anyone to try. That Seps when someone, a board member, chuckled and said, "What if the maid Seps' daughter tries?" Laughter erupted. It was cruel, the kind that cuts deeper than shouting. Leonard, enjoying the spectacle, leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Fine," he said, almost theatrically. "Win this game, and I'll give you $100 million. Cash. But if you lose..." He paused, his gaze locking on her. "You work for me. Forever." The room fell silent. This wasn't playful anymore. It was a social trap. Elena's heart pounded, not just from fear, but from the quiet rage of a lifetime spent watching powerful men turn her mother into furniture. She didn't know the rules of his game yet, but she knew one thing: walking away meant they'd all remember her, as the girl who didn't even try. She smiled. Deal. The room erupted again, but this time, not all the laughter was cruel. Some people were watching with curiosity, wondering if the underdog had teeth. What Elena didn't know yet was that this game wasn't just about puzzles, it was designed to break people, and Leonard had never lost. Cut to black. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes the first step to power is saying said yes sit to something you said you're not yet ready for, because it forces you to grow into it. The screen lingers on her determined face. And that sets where the story begins. The screen fades in on a dimly lit kitchen, the hum of an old refrigerator, the sound of rain against a thin roof. Elena grew up in the kind of home where silence wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. Her mother, Patricia Daniels, worked 2 jobs, days at a hotel, nights cleaning the estates of the city's elite. Elena learned early that rich people rarely saw the person scrubbing their floors. They only saw the work. Her father, gone before she could remember his face. The only stories her mother told were about his mind, how he could take apart an engine and rebuild it faster than most people could find a wrench. But poverty doesn't care about talent. Without connections, brilliance goes unnoticed. And so Elena inherited 2 things. Her father sits restless intelligence. Her mother sits unshakable endurance. By age 12 she was teaching herself logic puzzles and chess strategies from discarded books she found at a thrift store. By 15, she could calculate compound interest in her head faster than her teachers could write it on the board, but none of that mattered in the eyes of the system. The local school board had already labeled her a good kid who probably won't go far, not because of her grades, but because she didn't fit the profile for scholarship tracks. She was a maid's daughter. Statistically speaking, the world had already decided where she would land. Here's the part most people miss. Systemic bias doesn't always come with a sneer or a slur. Sometimes it's just the quiet removal of opportunity. The counselor who forgets to mention an application deadline. The teacher who assumes your good grades are a fluke. The room you stir never invited into. It wasn't that Elena lacked ambition. It was that ambition, in her world, had to be invisible. She could outthink half the city, but she learned to do it silently. Then came the night that changed everything. Her mother came home from work pale, her voice trembling. She had accidentally spilled champagne on one of Leonard Graves' custom suits, a suit worth more than 6 months of rent. Instead of firing her, he smirked and said she could work it off by taking an extra shift at his private event. That was the event where Elena stood in the corner, listening to the Billionaire Seps challenge. That was the night she realized something. This was the first time in her life the system had given her a door, even if it was a trap. She didn't know the rules of the game yet. She didn't know that Leonard Graves' so-called challenge was rooted in psychological warfare, but she knew she'd been training for something like this her entire life. And deep down, Leonard had underestimated the most dangerous kind of opponent. The one who has nothing to lose, and everything to prove. The mentor Stead's voice returns, steady. Sometimes, the root cause of greatness is forged in the quiet years, when the world isn't watching, That sits when resilience becomes muscle, and when the moment finally comes you realize you've been preparing for it all along. The rain fades into silence. The scene shifts. Leonard leans forward in his gold-plated chair. "Are you ready?" he asks. "More than you think," she replies. The mentor's voice is low, deliberate, the kind that makes you lean in. Every great story has a moment when the hero realizes, this isn't just a game, this is a test of who they are willing to become. The ballroom was clearing out now, the laughter fading into the echo of clinking glasses being collected by waiters. But in the center of the room, the billionaire remained, and so did Elena. On the marble table between them sat the game he had promised. At first glance, it looked deceptively simple. A square board divided into 64 black and white tiles, each with a small golden token on it. Leonard tapped the board like a man, showing off a trick he'd done 1,000 times. "You have 3 hours," he said. "Move the tokens according to the rules. Arrange them in the pattern I sip hidden in this envelope. If you succeed, $100 million is yours. If you fail..." He let the pause linger, his gaze sharp. "You work for me. No salary, no exit, forever." Elena frowned. "That sit's not legal." Leonard chuckled. "It sits a gentleman sits agreement. And don't sit worry. When you lose I still make sure you stir, comfortable." The trap was clear. If she refused now, she'd walk away humiliated, her mother's position destroyed. If she accepted, she'd be playing a game built for her to fail, and she'd be bound to him for life. And here's where the moral fork in the road becomes dangerous. When both options look like loss, people tend to choose the one that at least feels like agency. Her mother, standing silently at the door, mouthed no, because she understood something most people miss. Sometimes the only way to avoid losing is to change the definition of winning. "I sell play," she said, "but we add one rule." Leonard tilted his head. "Go on." "If I win, you don't sit just give me the money. You sign over full control of your foundation, the one that invests in youth programs, for 10 years. The shift in the room was immediate. Now it wasn't just about ego, it was about power. Leonard leaned back, smiling thinly. "You stir clever, I like that, but it won't sit matter. You stir lose." What neither of them said out loud was this. For Leonard this was entertainment. For Elena, this was war. And as she sat down at the table, fingers hovering over the first token, she understood the weight of the choice she'd just made. The mentor set's voice cuts in again. "Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes the choice isn't sits between risk and safety. It sits between dying quietly and daring loudly. And when you choose the latter, you start no longer just playing their game. You start rewriting it." The clock started. 3 hours. The first token moved. Fade to black. Soft piano plays under the narrator's voice, measured, patient. When someone appears powerless, it sits often because the world has mistaken silence for weakness, but silence can be a vault holding skills no one suspects until it sits too late. Leonard thought this was just a puzzle. Elena knew better. From the moment she saw the board, she recognized patterns hidden in plain sight. Sequences that echoed the logic puzzles she used to solve late at night on her bedroom floor, except these weren't random. Each token's position hinted at a mathematical rhythm, like musical notes arranged on a staff. What Leonard didn't know was that Elena's father, before disappearing, used to leave her coded messages in the margins of her school notebooks. It wasn't a game to him, it was his way of teaching her how to think in layers, to see what others missed. The first thing she did was ignore the obvious moves. That's a psychological trick most experts know. When someone designs a challenge to trap you, the most dangerous path is the one that feels safe. She studied the board sit symmetry. She counted not just the tiles, but the time it would take for each sequence to reset. She noticed that certain tokens, when moved, forced others into predetermined positions, almost like hidden gears turning in a clock. But here's the real weapon. Elena didn't try to solve the puzzle all at once. Instead, she broke it into micro goals, each small victory building momentum, while also keeping her calm. That's called chunking, a cognitive technique used by elite problem solvers to avoid overwhelm under time pressure. Meanwhile, Leonard was watching, expecting signs of panic. Instead, she was steady, controlled, almost surgical. That's when a few of the guests who had stayed to watch began to whisper. One of them, a tech investor, recognized the method. "She sits not guessing," he murmured. "She sits mapping it in her head." By the 45-minute mark, Elena had reached the first major reversal. A section of the board was now perfectly aligned with what she suspected the hidden pattern might be. She allowed herself the smallest smile. The mentor sit's voice cuts in. She didn't set know it yet, but that was the first small crack in his armor. And in any battle, once the opponent's set certainty begins to erode, everything changes. But Leonard wasn't going to just sit there. He had built this game to humiliate, not to lose. He leaned forward, voice dropping low. Careful, one wrong move and the entire sequence collapses. You instead have to start over with less time. It was a bluff. And she knew it. Because sometimes the hidden intelligence isn't just about knowing the solution, it's about reading the man who doesn't want you to find it. The clock ticked on. Her hand stayed steady. And somewhere deep inside, Leonard felt the first pulse of doubt. The music shifts, lower, heavier tones. The mentor's voice slows, adding weight to each word. When power feels threatened, it doesn't just defend itself. It changes the rules mid-game. Elena was deep into the second phase of the puzzle when the first disruption came. A waiter accidentally brushed past her, spilling champagne across the table. Tokens slid, the board warped under the liquid's weight. Leonard didn't flinch. In fact, he smiled. "Ah, unfortunate. I suppose you'll have to reset that section," he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. It wasn't an accident. It was the first systemic obstacle, the kind designed to break your rhythm, force you to burn time. In corporate boardrooms, courtroom battles, and political debates, the same tactic appears: manufacture chaos, then watch your opponent unravel. Elena's breathing quickened. She tried to remap the tokens in her head, but the clock kept ticking. It sounded louder now, more oppressive. An hour later, a second obstacle emerged. Leonard began inviting commentators to hover near the table, each whispering unhelpful advice, questioning her moves, suggesting better strategies. Their voices overlapped, a chorus of doubt. It was social pressure weaponized, the same way a biased hiring panel might pick apart a candidate's confidence until they start second-guessing themselves. And then came the third blow. One of the onlookers, a woman in a silver dress, leaned in close enough for Elena to hear her whisper, "If you lose, your mother loses everything, including the house." Elena froze. Her hands, so steady before, began to tremble. It was the breaking point, the moment where strategy gives way to fear. Her vision blurred. She miscalculated a move, and in an instant half the board collapsed into chaos. Leonard leaned back, sipping his drink like a man already tasting victory. The clock read 57 minutes. She wanted to slam her fists on the table, to shout at the unfairness of it, but instead, she just stared, not at the board, but at her own shaking hands. The mentor's voice cuts in softly. "Here sits the thing about breakdowns. They don't announce themselves with a scream. They creep in with a whisper, and before you know it, the fight you are losing isn't on the board, it sits in your own mind." For the first time since the game began, Elena's confidence cracked. And Leonard saw it. The background fades into a low, steady heartbeat sound. The mentor's voice is calm, deliberate, as if guiding us through a moment of stillness before the storm. Every collapse carries a choice: surrender to the spiral, or plant your feet in the middle of it. Elena's hands were still trembling when she heard it. A quiet voice from somewhere behind the cluster of onlookers. It was her mother. She wasn't supposed to speak, but the words came out anyway, low but steady. "Baby, remember the second letter." The second letter. 3 words that snapped Elena's mind back to a kitchen table from years ago. Her father leaning over a chessboard, teaching her one of his unorthodox strategies: never chase the king too soon, use the second letter. It wasn't about letters at all, it was about sequence. He'd taught her to find the second viable move in any position, not the first. The first move is usually the obvious one, the trap. The second, that's the doorway. She inhaled slowly. The noise from the crowd dulled. The ticking clock softened. Cognitive reframe, that's what psychologists call it, shifting your mental lens, so that the problem in front of you changes shape. It doesn't erase the pressure, it redefines it. Her breakdown hadn't been about the puzzle, it had been about their narrative. That she was a maid's daughter, out of her depth. Now she stripped that narrative away, and replaced it with a different one. "I'm a strategist, and this is my board." The second letter. She looked at the mess on the board, and didn't see chaos anymore. She saw possibilities. Instead of trying to rebuild the perfect pattern, she started building bridges, small clusters that could be linked together later. Leonard noticed. His smirk faltered. By the 30-minute mark, the clusters had doubled. By the 20-minute mark, they'd tripled. Each move wasn't just rebuilding, it was laying traps for the traps. The onlookers stopped talking. Even the woman in the silver dress stepped back, her earlier taunts silenced. Leonard leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You think you can turn this around?" Elena didn't look up. "I don't think, Leonard, I know." The mentor's voice cuts in again. A single action flipped the entire outcome, not because it solved the problem instantly, but because it shifted the power dynamic. Once you remember that you control your own pace, you start playing a different game. The final 10 minutes began. Elena Sepp's hands were steady again. And for the first time, Leonard's sets weren't The scene shifts to near silence, only the ticking of the clock and the soft scrape of tokens against the board. The mentor's voice is measured, almost whispering. The most dangerous climb is the one no one notices until you sit or standing above them. Elena moved with a rhythm now, precise, unhurried. She was no longer reacting to Leonard's traps, she was building her own architecture. Each token she placed wasn't just part of the solution, it was a trapdoor for any interference. The principle was simple but lethal: stabilize before you strike. In strategy, this is called positional play. You don't rush the winning move, you create a position so strong that the opponent's collapse becomes inevitable. Leonard, accustomed to opponents crumbling under time pressure, didn't recognize the danger yet. He saw her clusters forming, but not the invisible network between them, the sequence that would lock the board into place. Minute by minute, the chaos transformed into order. The champagne-soaked tiles, realigned. The collapsed middle section, rebuilt into a symmetrical bridge. The mismatched tokens, now part of a larger, mirrored pattern that hinted at the final design. The onlookers leaned in closer, sensing something but unable to name it. The woman in the silver dress whispered to another guest, "She sits ahead, isn't she?" By the 12-minute mark, Elena had reached a pivotal moment, the last major reconfiguration. This was where most challengers overplayed their hand, chasing the finish too early. But she remembered her father's rule, never rush the king. So she slowed down. And that's when Leonard finally saw it, the pattern taking shape, unmistakably close to the hidden design he had in that sealed envelope. He tried to interrupt. "You know, even if you finish, I can always say you got it wrong. My word is law here." Elena didn't look up. "You could," she said, moving another token into place, "but everyone here has been watching, and people remember the moment a man cheats to keep from losing." It was a quiet threat, but one with teeth. The murmurs in the room grew louder. For the first time, Leonard's audience wasn't entirely on his side. By the 5-minute mark, the board was nearly complete. By the 3-minute mark, Leonard's hands were clenched. By the final minute, the only sound was the clock's tick, each one a nail in the coffin of his certainty. The mentor Sit's voice cuts in softly. Power doesn't instead always shift with a bang. Sometimes it happens in the quiet, steady reclaiming of control, until the only thing left for your opponent to do is watch. Elena placed the final token in its slot. And for the first time that night, Leonard Graves had nothing to say. The room is holding its breath. The mentor's voice is low, steady, almost reverent. There sits a kind of silence that isn't sit emptiness. It sits the weight of everyone realizing they about to witness a shift. Elena Sit's final token clicked into place. The pattern stretched across the board like something inevitable, symmetrical, elegant, impossible to fake by accident. Leonard stared at it for a long beat, his smirk struggling to hold. The gold-sealed envelope sat between them, untouched since the start. Someone from the crowd, the tech investor from earlier, spoke up. "Well, open it." Leonard didn't move. A second voice joined in. "Open it, Graves." Soon, a ripple of murmurs became a chant, soft but insistent. "Open it, open it." Finally, with deliberate slowness, Leonard tore the envelope open. He unfolded the paper inside. His eyes scanned it once, then twice. When he looked up, his face was pale. "It matches," he said, his voice barely audible. The crowd reacted instantly, a mix of gasps, quiet applause, and whispers racing around the room. Someone pulled out their phone, recording every second. Elena didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just leaned back slightly, her hands resting on the edge of the table. "You know the terms." Leonard Sit's jaw tightened. $100 million and control of my foundation, for 10 years. Her voice was calm, surgical. "Signed, tonight, in front of witnesses." This was more than a win. This was a public reversal. In high-stakes negotiations, experts call this the irreversible moment, when the losing party can no longer salvage their image without conceding. Leonard's power had always been rooted in two things, his wealth and the perception that he couldn't be beaten. In less than 3 hours, Elena had dismantled both. He reached for a pen, signing the contract one of the guests hastily drafted on heavy parchment. Cameras flashed. "Here sits what that moment teaches us." The mentor's voice cuts in. "Victory is sweetest not when you take what they owe you, but when you take what they swore you could never touch." As the ink dried, Leonard's expression hardened, but there was nothing he could do. The room had already witnessed the turning of the tide. And the video of his loss was already leaving the building. The scene fades to a quiet city skyline at dawn. The mentor's voice returns, slow and deliberate. When the game ends, the real story begins, in the fallout, in the faces of those who never thought the system could bend. By morning, the footage of Leonard Graves' defeat had gone viral. The clip of him pale-faced, signing over $100 million and control of his foundation, was replayed on news segments, social feeds, and business podcasts. For the public, it was entertainment, the underdog who humiliated the billionaire. For the powerful elite, it was something else. A warning? Leonard's empire didn't collapse overnight, but cracks began to show. Investors started asking questions. Some quietly pulled their money. Board members began discussing his fitness to lead. His brand, once untouchable, became a cautionary tale. Elena, meanwhile, did something few expected. She didn't keep the $100 million for herself. Instead, she used it to fully fund the foundation, restructuring it to provide grants, mentorship, and startup capital for underrepresented youth. Within a year, dozens of programs launched across the city. Free coding boot camps in neighborhoods where tech companies never invested. Entrepreneurship incubators for young women of color. Scholarships that bypassed the biased recommendation systems of traditional academia. Her mother, Patricia, retired from cleaning houses. Not because she was tired, but because for the first time, she didn't have to survive on someone else's terms. Leonard avoided prison, but not humiliation. He retreated from public life, spending more time abroad, away from the city where a maid's daughter had bested him. The mentor Stet's voice softens. In the end, redemption doesn't always belong to the one who lost. Sometimes, redemption is the ripple, the system quietly shifting because someone proved it could be moved. One evening, a year after the win, Elena stood in a newly opened youth center funded by the foundation. A girl no older than 15 walked up to her, holding a chessboard under her arm. "Can you teach me?" she asked. Elena smiled. "Of course. But first let me tell you about the second letter." The cycle was starting again, but this time, the system wasn't holding the pieces. The screen fades to black and white still shots from earlier in the story. Elena's steady hands over the board, Leonard's pale face, the ink drying on the contract. The mentor's voice is calm, grounded, carrying the weight of a final truth. Power doesn't just change hands in moments like these. It changes shape, and when it does, it leaves a map for those who come after. Elena's victory wasn't just about the $100 million, or even about dismantling Leonard's arrogance. It was proof that the labels the system gives you aren't binding, that the ceilings they build above you are made of weaker material than they want you to believe. Here 6 what her journey teaches us. Preparation often happens in the shadows. The hours no one sees are the hours that decide everything. The first move isn't always the right move. Look for the second letter, the option they don't expect you to take. Redefine the win. Sometimes, victory isn't about beating them at their game, it's about changing what the game rewards. And maybe most importantly, a single act of courage can ripple far beyond the room it happens in. The programs Elena launched didn't just change individual lives, they created networks of influence that will outlast her lifetime. The girl with the chessboard, the young coder starting her first app, the boy who learned negotiation skills in a free workshop, these are the quiet revolutions that no billionaire can undo. The mentor's tone shifts, still calm, but with a direct edge now. So here sits your challenge. The next time you sit there handed a game designed for you to lose, pause, ask yourself, what sits my second letter? What sits the win they don't see coming? And then, play for that. The image fades to Elena standing at the front of a crowded community hall, smiling at a sea of young faces. Like, comment, and subscribe if this story resonated with your values. And remember, the board isn't theirs forever. Sometimes, all it takes is one move they never saw coming. Fade out. End screen.